Well, son, the waterfront's been fixed.
The honourable member for Gilmore.
Mr Speaker, my question without notice is directed to the Prime Minister and follows directly on from the answer just given by the Minister for Employment and Education, in which the Minister has just told us how the waterfront's been fixed and highlighted to us the so-called fantastic cost savings that have occurred on the waterfront. My question to the Prime Minister is, would the Prime Minister explain what is so fantastic about a reform program that leaves the Australian waterfront charging Tasman pulp and paper stevedoring rates of $11.13 per tonne, when in New Zealand the reforms there have reduced rates on the same cargo and ships to $2.96 a tonne? Is it not true that the only thing that is fantastic about your reforms is the $430 million that you've handed out to retiring wharfies to supplement their existing superannuation, sick leave and long service payments?
Mr. Speaker,
the Honourable Prime Minister.
I'm not aware of what the prices of on the thing.
Order.
I don't carry tariff rates on ships around in my head, but I do know that everything that my colleague the Minister said about waterfront productivity is entirely true. We've been through one of the most far-reaching reform processes in an industry that was left fallow by you for 40 years. For all of these practices were wound up for 40 years, including in the decade, or 7 years of the decade, when the member for Bennelong and the member for Wentworth were Treasurer and Advisor to the government of the day. How come you never noticed?
Member for Mayo, the Minister for Immigration.
How come you never noticed any of these structural matters then? How come the waterfront was never an issue in the 70s, but all of a sudden became an issue after 40 years under a Labor government? And how come we've been able to solve it without a day's working day lost, when your leader was proposing he should solve it by putting soldiers on wharves? I mean, isn't it an amazing contrast that here is the most sophisticated change which has seen an enormous increase in productivity on the waterfront, 46%, where you've got container handling today at levels comparable with any port in the world, and which is sort of stupidly denied every day by the opposition, but a process which has gone on between the companies and the unions and the government without a day lost, when bereft of any innovative thought, the Leader of the Opposition believed it could only be resolved by putting military people on the wharves. I mean, everyone in Australian business ought to be noting this and wondering, saying, God, this is true, and thank God we never had that remedy. And what about all the other structural areas? What about the coastal shipping and the decline to under OECD crew manning levels in coastal shipping? How did you let that get away from you? I mean, you're all asleep there in the 70s when they wound up all the people on the ships. I mean, I was a member of Parliament.
If the member for Mayo rejects again, I'll name him.
The opposition front bench or back bench were not the government of the day was responsible. The truth is, you let Australia rot. You let its competitive sectors rot. You let its goods markets rot. You let its service markets rot. And you let all of its international services rot. And this country had to get in, this government had to get in and remake the goods markets, remake for the first time the service markets, and take all the sclerosis out of the infrastructure of the economy, whether it be in shipping and ports, rail, telecommunications, whatever it might be. It's always left to the Labor Party to do the hard slogging work on the run-it-in problems which were put there under the years when you lot were asleep at the wheel, under the Rip Van Winkle years of Menzies and his successors. And it's no wonder you're so guilty when you talk about the Fraser government's record of doing nothing, because you did do nothing. You did do nothing through the period, and it has taken this government to do it. And now in the greatest area of change, again without massive disputation, a path-breaking landmark reform to industrial relations. That is, where we're seeing now all manner of flexibility in enterprise agreements across the country. Hours, working weeks, hours of work week, rates, holiday pay, the lot, all the flexibility there, and yet not with industrial disputes their lowest since we've been keeping records. And yet, and then, of course, the Minister for Finance today telling you that in the one claim you make for your GST, that it removes payroll tax, he makes a very obvious point made by Professor Freeburn that even a GST at 3.5% has no employment consequences that are beneficial, let alone a 15% goods and services tax.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I have a point of order relates to Standing Order 145. My question was about price differentials between the Australian and New Zealand waterfront. The Prime Minister is now talking about the GST and a question that was answered earlier. I would ask you to rule that the Prime Minister's answer is out of order.
Order. The Prime Minister will come back to the question.
Mr Speaker, not only will there not be an increase in employment, but the point that's got to be made about payroll tax is that of the 700,000 businesses in this country, 600,000 get no payroll tax relief.
Order.
Now that's the one you hate, because you're out there telling all the half-truths and untruths to all the little businesses, knowing full well they get no payroll tax relief and wear the 15% right on the chin.
Order. The honourable member for Menzies on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, point of order under Standing Order 145. You asked the Prime Minister to come back to the question. He's blatantly refusing to do that, and will you allow him to continue to insult your ruling?
The Prime Minister is answering the question. The Prime Minister. The House will come to order. Order. The member on my left will resume his seat. The Prime Minister was asked a question about the member for Kooyong. If the member for Kooyong interjects again, I'll deal with him. I've called him to order twice already today. The Prime Minister was asked a question about waterfront pricing and businesses. The Prime Minister is answering a question about the waterfront. The Prime Minister will come back to the matters affecting the waterfront.
Mr Speaker, I'm making a point about infrastructure, and that's the point of the question about Australia's infrastructure and international services. And on the greatest international service developed under this government, tourism, you want to put a 15% GST, a 15% GST.
Order. The honourable member for Gilmore on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. It relates to Standing Order 145, as you'd expect, and you've quite clearly made in your last ruling that the question was about the waterfront. The Prime Minister is now talking about tourism. It bears no...
Order. The House will come to order.
The Prime Minister's answer
will cease interjecting, as will the member for Macarthur.
Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister's answer bears absolutely no resemblance to the question. It is quite clearly out of order under Standing Order 145.
The Honourable Prime Minister will come back to the question.
Speaker, you see, they can ask their questions, but they can't take. They don't like the answers. They don't like the answers.
Order.
But I can tell you, as much disdain as it takes you taking it, it gives me more pleasure giving it to you. Now, Mr Speaker, let me just make this point. That is, there's been a revolution in the Australian waterfront, brought about, as there has in all other international services, brought about without industrial disputation. That is a model change which has occurred to bring up the waterfront competitiveness of Australia up to comparable levels with any of the ports around the world, and that includes, of course, crewing on Australian ships. And it may gall the opposition, it may gall them, on this most intractable of infrastructure problems. The government again has solved it, as it solved all the other international services. And I'm just making a point, for even their puny change, which they want to remove one tax in the economy, payroll tax, they put a 15% tax on 700,000 businesses and give relief to only 100,000. So 600,000 businesses will get no payroll tax relief, but they'll all wear the GST and they'll all spend their Sundays computing it. So, Mr Speaker, you haven't taken a trick. You sat there for years while all these infrastructure things just simply silted up on the Australian economy. You sat there asleep at the wheel until the Labor government came and did it. And now what you got is just simply cavilling questions which display how bereft you are of any original thought.